Thank you for joining us. We're going to start in just a few moments as we allow some additional attendees to join us. We will begin in 1 minute. Thank you all for joining us today. Welcome to our general session panel, Ethics, Navigating the Ethical Dilemmas in Everyday Engineering and Surveying Practice, also known as Keeping Your License, Your Integrity, and Your Sanity. I'd like to thank our sponsors of the 2021 annual conference today. They are on your screen right now. And for this particular session, we would like to recognize EBL Engineers as our sponsors. We'd like to thank them for their in-kind sponsorship of this conference. Established in 1972, EBL Engineers is a multidiscipline consulting engineering firm with registered professional engineers in mechanical, plumbing, electrical, and fire protection engineering. In addition, they provide cost coding, energy conservation, facilities management, and construction phase services. These services are performed for a multitude of private and government clientele who consistently come back to EBL to procure quality work and attention to detail. Again, we're beginning our presentation, Ethics, Navigating the Ethical Dilemmas in Everyday Engineering and Surveying Practice, otherwise known as Keeping Your License, Your Integrity, and Your Sanity. Presented today by David S.Thaler, PE, LS, DFE, DE, WRE, EWRI, FRGS, F.ASCE, F.NSPE, and Managing Member and Principal D.S. Thaler and Associates, and Andrew Brown, PE Project Manager with Vogel Engineering and the Timmons Group. In 2019, David Thaler won the award as the top engineer in the United States. He is the Managing Principal of D.S. Thaler and Associates, LLC, a civil and environmental engineering firm that he founded in 1976. He's a fellow of the NSPE, ASCE, and the Royal Geographical Society in London. He is a board-certified diplomat of both the National Academy of Forensic Engineering and the American Academy of Water Resources Engineering. He's received multiple Lifetime Achievement Awards and holds Maryland's highest military honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, as well as the Militia Medal with the Bronze Star. He's involved with projects of extraordinary complexity, and his firm has designed more than 4,300 land development assignments throughout the Mid-Atlantic region. He invented the super silt fence, as well as other innovative land development techniques. And he has published more than 250 articles and 5 books on a wide variety of subjects, and has lectured at a lot more than a dozen colleges and universities, including the University of Baltimore School of Law, where he was a visiting scholar. And he's also like Monty Hall. If you can actually tell him what each one of those letters after his name means, he will give you $10. He's joined today by Andrew Brown, who has spent the last decade working in the engineering construction field His background includes construction inspection, geotechnical engineering, stormwater treatment, land development, and project management. Between his time in the field, his time in the office designing project, Andrew brings a wealth of knowledge and experience in navigating the ethical gray areas that are often encountered in the industry. So today, for our version of Between Two Bow Ties, it's our pleasure to welcome both Andrew Brown and David S.Thaler. The floor is yours.
Great, Tim. Thank you for that introduction. And I think Dave's introduction is like almost half the length of our presentation, so that was great. So let's dive right in.
That was our presentation.
That was it. That was great. We really just get those credentials out there. All right. So let's dive right in. Courses in engineering ethics typically review the various codes of ethics and then discuss a few case studies of the NSPE Board of Ethical Review. Today, we'd like to take a somewhat different approach. We want to review the ethical issues typically faced in everyday engineering and surveying practice, and especially review common causes of complaints and disciplinary actions before the Maryland Board of Professional Engineers. But first, a disclaimer. This talk is not an authorized production of the licensing board. It simply represents mine and David's personal views based upon, in my case, 10 years, and in David's case, nearly 50 years of successfully dealing with the ethical issues of everyday professional practice. So we want to share some best practices for navigating the ethical shoals that we've learned through the years, but the opinions expressed are simply our own. So let's start with the most fundamental question. Why do we even have a code of ethics anyway? Besides getting required CPC credits for listening to this presentation, why should engineers care about ethics?
Well, Andrew, I'm really glad you asked, because the answer is pretty simple. Not having an ethical code or not following one can lead to very severe consequences. In the most extreme cases, and not to be overly dramatic, property can be damaged and people can be injured or die. But more typically, there could be lawsuits and complaints filed with the professional licensing board. You could be sanctioned, reprimanded, or fined, and your license could potentially be suspended or even revoked if you fail to follow the code of ethics. Now, while some ethical issues are black and white, those are the easy ones. We no doubt learned them in grade school. Don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal, and to that we would add do good work. The more difficult issues are the gray areas that often present dilemmas, balancing your obligations to your client and employer versus your obligation to the public, for instance. As they say, problems have solutions, dilemmas have horns. Speaking of dilemmas, I think I'd like to start our presentation today off with a real-life dilemma I encountered very early in my career. In fact, the only reason I'm here today, having been in the engineering business now for over 46 years, is because of what, in my opinion, was the greatest lapse of engineering ethics in the history of the nation. Because the main perpetrator came within a whisker of becoming the President of the United States, and his name was Spiro Agnew. I knew him, a lawyer in Towson. Agnew was chair of the Baltimore County PTA, and in a rather improbable chain of events, he became the Baltimore County executive, then the governor of the state of Maryland, and finally the vice president of the United States. Now, apparently, going back to the turn of the 20th century, it was common practice in Baltimore County that whenever an engineer received an engineering contract, you kicked back a percentage of it to the county executive. So when Spiro Agnew became county executive, he began receiving kickbacks from the engineers who obtained public works contracts, generally for road and bridge design. Now, when Agnew became governor, he created a scheme whereby the head of the State Roads Commission, the predecessor to the SHA, a PE named Jerry Wolf, would inform a developer, Bud Hammerman, who served as the bagman, what firms were likely to get state contracts, and Hammerman would then solicit kickbacks from them. He apparently solicited 8 firms, 7 of which paid the bribes, generally 1 to 5% of the contract amount, which would be split 50% to Agnew and 25% each to Hammerman and Wolf. One firm refused to pay and received fewer state contracts as a result. Now, the payoffs continued after Agnew became vice president. 2 engineers, Alan Green and Lester Matz, testified that they paid off Agnew at the vice president's office in the old executive office building next to the White House in D.C. Matz delivered white envelopes with thousands of dollars and $100 of bills in it, and Green plaintively noted, and I quote, "It was necessary to become a participant in the kickback scheme in order to survive in the consulting business," unquote. That's the ethical dilemma, isn't it? If you want to be, his justification was, if you want to be in the consulting business, you have to pay the kickbacks. Now, Elliot Richardson, who was then the United States Attorney General, and the Baltimore-based United States attorneys had to get Agnew out of office quickly because they knew that Nixon was about to resign or be indicted or be impeached. And if he was, Agnew would become president of the United States. And whatever else you may think about Donald Trump, Agnew would have made Trump look like Mary Poppins. Now, this thrilling story is wonderfully recounted in Rachel Maddow's podcast and new book called Bagman: The Wild Crimes, Audacious Cover-Up, and Spectacular Downfall of a Brazen Crook in the White House. Now, the engineers were apparently interviewed for the book, and they were treated somewhat sympathetically, it seems to me. They justified their participation in the scheme as being necessary to stay in the engineering business. Now, I'm not so sure I'm as sympathetic. Our firm refused to work in Prince George's County in the years when it was known to be corrupt. Andrew, what would you do in a similar situation?
Well, I'd like to think I would have the ethical fortitude and wisdom to not get caught up in this.
Well, that's absolutely correct. Now, Agnew ended up being indicted, and he pleaded no contendere or no contest to his charges, and he resigned on October 10th, 1973. Hammerman, the bagman, got 18 months in jail. Wolf, a PE and head of the State Roads Commission, got 8 months and lost his engineering license, but regained it on a technicality. And at least one of the other participating engineers went to jail, but most were United States witnesses and unindicted co-conspirators.
Wow, so this ran pretty deep. So, Dave, how did you know to avoid getting caught up in all of this?
Well, at this time, I was really in the building business. I had a designer, and I had my PE license at a time. But my first job right out of college was a union job, rebuilding a bridge in Allentown, Pennsylvania. And I learned on day one, you don't pay bribes, or you're in the pocket of the union forever. And so, because many of the leading engineers in Maryland, certainly in the Baltimore area, had faced this ethical dilemma and chosen poorly, and were either in jail or were tainted, ours was one of the few untainted firms left standing. And a huge amount of work started coming in, and it's never let up. Now, we face ethical dilemmas every day, and sometimes they present very difficult choices. But without being too melodramatic, if we don't maintain ethical standards, bad things may very well happen. For as Hercule Poirot once put it, old sins cast long shadows.
Great. Thanks for sharing that real life example there. So today,
Andrew, that's the only reason I'm here today in the engineering business, because of the ethical lapses of some other engineers.
So, well, you're the right one to be here then, for sure. So today we want to focus on some of the real ethical issues and dilemmas typically faced by engineers. And as David said, a common example of a dilemma faced by engineers is one of balancing our obligations. So we want to start with that. What are our obligations as engineers? There's 4 basic sets of ethical obligations that we typically refer to. One is of the public, one is to our employer or our client, the other obligation is to other professionals, and then we have an obligation to ourselves and our family. And yes, I did stick a picture of myself and my kids in the presentation.
Adorable kids, I might add.
Thank you. So if this were Star Trek and I were Captain Kirk, I would say for sure our prime directive as engineers is to protect the public. This is our primary obligation and the main reason that we're licensed. Interestingly, It's not always been this way. When the Code of Ethics was first developed, it was the obligation to the employer that was considered primary. But over time, the code has evolved to prioritize the protection of the public health and safety. However, our obligations are not mutually exclusive. Following one does not eliminate the obligation to follow the others. It is in this gray area where these obligations come into conflict that present the trickiest ethical problems.
As a starting line, we can reduce these obligations to some basic principles. One, protect the public health, welfare, and safety. As Andrew mentioned, this is our primary responsibility. Next, make sure your contracts and basis of compensation are clear. Poorly drafted contracts are a tremendous source of conflict and complaints. Practice competently. Only practice in your area of competency and don't screw up. Admit it though when you do, everybody does now and again, and deal with it. Unlike fine wine, mistakes don't age well. The quicker problems are addressed and nipped in the bud, the less painful they are to resolve. Be honest. An engineer must be truthful and honest in all dealings. However, as we shall see, this simple timeless tenet is violated more often than you might imagine. Preserve confidentiality to both your employer and a client. Be aware of the changing rules for emerging technologies. Much engineering today is done by computer, virtually. What are our obligations for reviewing and signing virtual plans? And finally, avoid conflicts of interest. Conflicts of interest are anything perceived or otherwise that could affect your professional judgment. Ethical issues and dilemmas come up all the time, and I follow a rule that has served me very well in my many years of practice when I confront an ethical question. It's quite simple, but it's really pretty powerful, and I like to call it Thaler's iron law of ethics, and that is, when in right, do the right thing.
Wait a second. David, Thaler's iron law, surely your big takeaway for a group of licensed engineers cannot be as simple as, when in doubt, do the right thing. I mean, this sounds like an elementary school ethics lesson. Isn't that a bit too simple and obvious for what we're trying to talk about today?
All right, young grasshopper, let me illustrate this with a story, which happened to me recently, which may illustrate the principle of doing the right thing. Now, in Baltimore County, there is almost no undeveloped apartment land left. And because there is such a high demand, it's extremely valuable. A 20-acre piece of property came on the market recently for which the seller had obtained a wetland delineation. And the delineation showed that the property was roughly 80% wetlands and largely undevelopable. The owner was asking only $100,000 for the property, but had it been developable as multifamily, it would probably be worth $3 million. Now, we had worked on this property many years ago, and I looked at his delineation, and it just didn't feel right to me. So I went out into the field with my soil probe and Munsell color chart and my trusty, highly accurate wetlands indicator, which is my boots. If they come back muddy, it's probably wetlands. But sure enough, when I did the site visit, certainly didn't look like wetlands to me. And so I called one of our very best clients who was desperate for multifamily land. And I said, I may have found you a great deal. And I suggested he draft a contract. Before he could get it submitted, a developer from DC with whom we had never worked before called and said he had the property under contract and wanted to hire us. And so what should we do? We had no obligation to the new guy. We didn't even know who he was. We had never worked with him before. And we didn't have an obligation to reveal our suspicions that his wetland delineation was wrong. We could have easily done nothing at all, and the new developer would find out that his property was largely wetlands. He would drop his contract, and then our client could then get it at a bargain. These are the types of dilemmas that arise all the time. And so I asked myself, what's the right thing to do? And I decided it was clearly to tell the new developer what we suspected and what we knew, and that is that we believed that the wetland delineation was inaccurate and that the property was indeed developable. So our story, and it turned out to be that way. And so our story ends with two very happy clients. One who had a developable property that he obtained at a bargain price, and the other who really appreciated us thinking of them and will certainly use this on his next job. I also have a thought experiment that I use when I confront a tough decision. I imagine I'm standing before the judge sometime in the future and explaining why I did what I did. Sometimes I say it out loud or to someone else, and I see how it sounds. If it doesn't sound right and convincing to me, it certainly won't be to the judge, and so I don't do it. That technique has kept me out of a lot of trouble through the years.
I found this is also it's also helpful to imagine when you're writing an email. Imagine an attorney reading your email back to you during a hearing. It'll make you think twice about what you put in writing and how you choose to word it. Keep in mind that this scenario is not as far-fetched as it may seem either. Remember that both texts and emails are discoverable should you be involved in some type of litigation. Regardless of the casual nature of the interaction, you should always be very mindful of what you're putting in writing. But it's not just limited to writing. As a licensed professional, your opinion can have significance, and your words could be used against you. Be careful when sharing opinions. I find often less is more in this department. But if you're like Dave here and you just simply cannot resist the urge to share an opinion, then at the very least, make it clear when something's your personal opinion versus your opinion as a professional. So we've covered our obligations as engineers and the basic principles for ethical practice. This is a nice prelude to step into a very commonly misunderstood but essential part of being a licensed professional engineer, the professional seal. I recall when I first received my PE license, I was so excited to see my name on the official seal. I was eager to sign and seal my first drawing. However, I did not fully understand what it could mean for me to sign and seal a document beyond certifying that I had reviewed it and approved it. I'd heard all kinds of stories ranging from panic-inducing forever liability where an angry mob will come after you should anything ever go wrong on that project, to the opposite end of the spectrum where an engineer would flippantly seal anything, citing that it all just falls back on the company. It is essential that you clearly understand just what sealing a drawing actually means. Now, Dave, can you please explain the meaning of the engineering seal?
Happy to. And as Andrew mentioned, I also find the purpose of the seal is widely misunderstood. Now, this is somewhat surprising to me, as the professional seal is truly the very essence of being a professional engineer. Engineering licensing began in Wyoming, of all places, in 1907. Where's Wyoming again? And grew out of the progressive movement at the turn of the 20th century, along with the rise of the learned professions. But seals far predate the licensure of engineering. Seals are ancient. And in fact, a 7,000-year-old impression seal was recently discovered in Israel, which dates back before the invention of writing. Seals predate the invention of writing. It's unbelievable. Now, this one dates back 2,500 years to the early Iron Age, and it has letters identifying it as someone's name up on the top. Now, perhaps this was an ancient engineer. I don't know.
Well, ancient engineer. Wait, Dave, is that your seal?
Very funny, smart Alec. I did see that you managed to sneak your seal into a picture or two. And like our seals today, these ancient impression seals serve the very same purpose. They serve as a means of identification and authentication. The use of the seal was common in medieval times when the ability to write was uncommon, but everyone of means possessed a coat of arms or some other distinctive device. Now, this is one of the 5 surviving copies of the Magna Carta agreed to by King John at Runnymede on June 15, 1215, and it's with his royal seal affixed. Now, he didn't sign it. Now, King John was quite literate, but in medieval times, folks didn't sign documents as we would today. They attached their seal to authenticate them. Now, this is the map of survey prepared by Mason and Dixon in 1767 of their iconic survey of what is now the Maryland, Pennsylvania, Delaware border. This sealed map is right here in Baltimore in the basement of the Maryland Center for History and Culture, formerly known as the Maryland Historical Society. Now, this survey is arguably the greatest engineering achievement of the 18th century. So 500 years after the Magna Carta, the map of survey prepared by Mason and Dixon in 1767 was sealed and also signed by all 12 of the boundary commissioners, 6 from Maryland and 6 from Pennsylvania. There was once a legal distinction between sealed and unsealed documents, but while that distinction has largely passed, impression seals are still used today for authenticating documents such as birth, marriage, and death records. I remember well when impression seals were commonly used on paper engineering drawings over our signatures to authenticate them, but over time, the use of a wet seal in the form of a rubber stamp became much more common.
Well, I'm impressed that you managed to work the Magna Carta and the Mason and Dixon survey into the same presentation. But as much as I'd love to continue to indulge your irrepressible urge to give a history lesson, let me interrupt a moment. I think we all understand that seals authenticate our plans. Is there something more we should understand about a signature and seal, Dave?
Well, Andrew, the point I was trying to get around to before being rudely interrupted is that a professional seal signifies more than just authentication. When a PE signature and seal are used on a set of plans or documents, they serve as a signal to the clients, regulators, and the public that the documents meet applicable engineering standards from a professional who is qualified by education, experience, and licensing, and is ethically bound to guard the health, safety, and welfare of the public. Now, inherent in the use of the signature and seal is personal knowledge. The NSPE Code of Ethics is clear. It states, engineers shall hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public, and engineers shall approve only those engineering documents that are in conformity with applicable standards. It also states engineers shall undertake assignments only when qualified by education or experience in the specific technical fields involved, and engineers shall not affix their signatures to any plans or documents dealing with subject matter in which they lack competence, nor to any plan or document not prepared under their direction and control. And so an engineer who signs and seals plans and documents is personally assuring the public that he or she has reviewed them. Let me go back to that. Personally assuring the public that he or she has reviewed them and that they're safe and that they meet applicable engineering standards. Now, in order to do so, the responsible engineer must personally either prepare or review the documents, and if reviewing, must have the ability to change the plans if he finds it necessary before signing and sealing. I don't think it is widely appreciated that personal responsibility cannot be evaded. Personal responsibility cannot be evaded. If something is wrong with the plans, the engineer who signs and seals them is personally responsible and could be sued.
Okay, so what about the common notion that responsibility will fall on the company and not the engineer? I hear a lot of engineers assume that any liability will fall on the company that they work for.
Well, a personal suit against the signing engineer tends to not happen very often because no additional insurance coverage is available by suing the engineer personally rather than just suing the firm. However, my firm does a fair amount of forensic engineering, almost always on the fence, and I am continually amazed to discover how many engineers and firms don't actually carry malpractice insurance. Some truly believe they're putting all their assets, and their spouse's name is as good as insurance. And also, curiously, in my experience, other than a few national merchant builders, most clients never inquire whether you have malpractice insurance, much less require it. Now, engineers also tend not to be sued personally because the poor engineer is a more sympathetic defendant than the big bad corporation, but it does happen. Indemnifications, however, are ethically permitted, and a firm should identify its engineers from personal malpractice claims. In my firm, we also put a clause in our contracts when our clients, with our clients, that the engineer who signs and seals the drawings as well as the officers, employees of the corporation, are not personally liable for any claims.
Okay, so there are ways to mitigate personal liability, at least from a litigation standpoint, but it does not absolve engineers of their personal responsibility when sealing plans. With that said, let's review some important rules for signing and sealing. You have to be you're either personally preparing or supervising or reviewing the plans. You can only sign them if they're safe and meet applicable engineering standards. And if you are reviewing, you must be able to change the plan. It is astounding to me that there are engineers who sign plans without actually reviewing them. Also, some engineers will allow their name and seal to be affixed by someone else. Both are very bad practices that create risk for both the engineer and the safety of the public.
I want to tell a story about a real complaint that was filed with the Professional Surveyors Board. And I've simplified the explanation and the drawing. And in fact, I don't know all the exact circumstances, and I'm just using this as an example. Now, this, we've redrawn it, but this is a location survey that was made of a house on a somewhat rectangular lot with a rather large backyard. And this, it's a location survey, again, or mortgage inspection, as they're called. And it was ultimately signed and sealed and provided to the owners when they bought the house at closing. Now, unfortunately, the surveyor who signed this missed the elephant in the room. It's hard to believe, but there was actually another house right in the backyard. And additionally, there was a property line right where you might expect it between the two houses, 25 feet off the first house. Now, the house in the backyard is not very hard to spot. It's clearly evident from either Google Earth, GIS, or a field visit. So how can you explain this mishap? I really don't know, and I'm just speculating as to what happened. But it seems to me that either the surveyor who sealed the survey did not check it very carefully, perhaps he did not visit the site himself, or perhaps a survey technician, this is more likely, put the seal and signature on the plan, which on the original looks very much like it could have been computer generated. Now, in this case, a lawsuit is likely to ensue. The owner of the house will likely, it seems to me, assert that they did not get the big backyard that they thought they were getting. Now, I don't know exactly what happened, but what we have is a sealed survey that missed the house that was on the property. The seal asserts that it's been done either by or under the direction of the licensed surveyor, and for whatever reason, it's clearly wrong. And I suspect, but I'm not sure, that someone else applied the seal. I found it's an all too common practice that a licensed surveyor or engineer will let someone else use their seal, and sometimes a signature stamp, and sometimes a computer generated signature. And as this example shows, I think that can be a very dangerous practice.
So we've laid out some of the basics of our obligations, what a seal really means, and David managed to sneak in a history lesson. Now, with some basics covered, let's dive into some of the consequences of ethics, or rather the consequences of not adhering to them. What are the real world consequences we should be concerned about, and what are some of the practical issues we are most likely to face? In this section, we're going to discuss some of the trouble that you may face and some tips for staying out of it. So let's start with engineers facing complaints and disciplinary action before the Maryland Board of Professional Engineers. When it comes to complaints filed with the Professional Licensing Board, the numbers are interesting. There are about 18,000 licensed professional engineers in Maryland, and only approximately 20 complaints a year are filed. This is about 1% of the number of complaints filed against lawyers, but that's a discussion for another day. The engineering complaints are reviewed by the Complaint Committee of the Licensing Board, and if deemed appropriate, are investigated further and disciplinary action taken if necessary. In the 5 years between 2015 and 2019, there were 46 disciplinary actions taken, averaging about 9 per year. Of the 46 disciplinary actions, an incredible 37 were for failure to comply with continuing professional competency or CPC requirements. Of the rest, one license was revoked because it was issued in error. In that time period, there was only one other case in which a license was suspended, and that was of a bridge inspector who inspected a road bridge and used photographs from a prior year's inspection without disclosing the fact, and inspected from the top of the roadway grid instead of under the rigging, which was the proper practice. While found not to be in imminent danger of collapse, the bridge had to be closed when the true condition was discovered. This perhaps dramatically illustrates why honesty is so important. Had the deteriorated state of the bridge not been discovered by another firm, the bridge may very well have collapsed with catastrophic consequences. In addition, one engineer was fined $15,000 for practicing without a license. One was fined for unauthorized siding and sealing, and one was disciplined for unlicensed practice. Those who were disciplined for CPC violations typically agreed to a consent order and paid a fine of $1,500. So between 2015 and 2019, only one license was revoked, and that was due to an issuing error, and one PE license was suspended. I would also like to point out that none of the engineering disciplinary actions in Maryland in those 5 years between 2015 and 2019 were for technical failures, which thankfully are very rare and often result when engineering decisions are overruled by political or managerial ones. Prominent examples being the Challenger disaster and more recently, the Surfside condominium collapse. So let me reiterate, in the 5 years between 2015 and 2019, 81% of the disciplinary actions taken by the licensing board were for failure to comply with CPC requirements.
Now, Andrew, while that statistic is a lot less dramatic than bridges collapsing, it's troubling on two levels. First, CPC in Maryland is only 16 hours every 2 years, the lowest of any state that has CPC, and really no challenge to do. You just need the discipline to do it and document that you have done so. And if you don't take meaningful continuing education in a profession that changes as rapidly as ours, then I don't know how you can possibly stay in business. And furthermore, many PEs, and probably most, if not everybody who's listening this morning, belong to NSPE, which provides 16 hours of free CPC. But what's even more troubling is that those PEs who were disciplined for not complying with CPC had certified on their renewal application that they had. Now, to me at least, not taking CPC is an engineering misdemeanor, but lying about it is an engineering felony. Certifying something that is patently untrue violates our solemn obligations of honesty and protection of the public. Personally, I think the board is being rather lenient in only requiring the necessary CPC to be taken and imposing a fine, generally $1,500, as opposed to suspending the license of violators.
So David, if most of the disciplinary actions that are taken revolve around CPC, then is our big practical ethics takeaway simply get your continuing education and don't lie about it? Having our wrists slapped for not getting CPC credit surely is not the biggest practical concern. What about the other complaints that were filed?
Well, I'm really glad you asked that, because many, if not most, of the complaints filed with the engineering board have to do with consumer and contractual disputes. Engineers sometimes are not the best contract drafters, nor the best businessmen for that matter, and ambiguous contracts are a fertile area for disputes. Our next tip for staying out of trouble is to make sure you are working under an unambiguous written contract. Now, it's very important to make sure that you have a written contract clearly laying out your contractual obligations and making sure your work scope is absolutely clear. Some states have laws requiring written contracts by design professionals. Maryland does not. But while not required by the Code of Ethics, having a written contract with a clear scope is a really important business practice. Now, in the session this morning that preceded us, I heard Paul Knopp suggest that it might be best not to have written contracts. I might argue with him a little bit on that, but what he clearly said is that the scope of services and the compensation be clearly laid out in an email, and that was an enforceable a contract. And that's really the point. In writing, lay out exactly what the scope of services is and what the basis of compensation is. Now, the reason for doing this is severalfold. First, a written agreement reduces misunderstandings by laying out the scope of the assignment, the schedule, and the terms of compensation. And secondly, a written agreement allows you to make your own rules. Will any dispute be first settled by mediation, for instance? And perhaps most importantly, all construction projects entail risk. And the written agreement allows you to fairly apportion those risks. Will there be a limitation of liability, for example? Complaints related to contractual disputes are often filed with the board, and their frequency could be much reduced with better contracts.
All right. So our next tip for staying out of trouble is do what you know. Practice only in your area of competency. This is an area that sometimes trips up lawyers who, once licensed, can take any type of case that walks in the door. This includes some cases that they shouldn't take, which can get them into trouble. Engineers sometimes make the same mistake when facing the pressures of a client asking them to perform tasks outside of their area of competency. But our ethical obligations are absolutely clear on the point. Only take what you know, despite the temptation to sometimes do otherwise. It's our ethical obligation to practice competently. But what does it mean, and to what standard are we held? The standard by which we are all measured is known as the standard of care, which is defined as our requirement to perform services consistent with that level of care and skill ordinarily exercised by members of the same profession practicing under similar circumstances and performing similar services in the same or similar locality in the same period of time. The wording may vary, but the idea is always the same. The standard of care is what our peers are doing on a similar assignment. The standard of care doesn't require perfection, however. Probably every engineering design can be improved if value engineered long enough. Sometimes we see contracts asking us to design to the highest standard of care, but there's no such thing. There is only the standard of care. Suppose the design standard for a storm drain system is to design to the 20-year storm. Well, what would be the highest standard of care then? 25 years, 50 years, 100-year design? There is no highest standard of care. Under the law, we are only required to perform to the standard of care. It is also inadvisable to hold yourself out as an expert or a specialist. An expert or specialist may indeed be held to some higher expert standard of care rather than the customary standard of care that typically applies.
So, Andrew, do you know what it's called when we fail to meet the standard of care?
Yes, Dave, I believe that's called malpractice.
I have taught you so well. Speaking of malpractice, reminds me of an example of the importance of following the standard of care and the necessity to always be honest and accept existing conditions. It has been my experience that there's a tendency on the part of some engineers when a problem arises with the existing conditions that may hard to solve to simply change them. Anne Arundel County has a law which prevents development on steep slopes, which are defined as those greater than 15%. On a very large project in Anne Arundel County, there were steep slopes which prevented the full development of the property, and so the genius engineers, as they put it, flattened the slopes. That is, they simply flattened the existing topography shown on the plans. Now, I don't mean that they graded out the slopes, which they wouldn't have been permitted to do under the law. I mean they changed the existing topography to flatten the appearance of the slopes and then proceeded to design the development to the fabricated topography. Now, here's their actual plan. This took place before CAD design, and so this is a real print. And if you look, these sort of dotted lines below the plan are the aerial photogrammetry. Well, in certain areas of the plan, it was greater than 15%, and so the engineers thought it would be a good idea to simply flatten them out. And this is the smoking gun that you're looking at. The red lines are how they changed the existing aerial photogrammetry to make it a flatter slope than it actually was. And then you can see they designed it to it. There's a little road or driveway coming through that is designed to the fabricated topography instead of the real topography. Now, the topography they created might as well have been on Mars. And the storm drain outfalls, to use but one example, could have been 20 feet in the air or 20 feet in the ground, and you wouldn't have known which. Now, this catastrophe really was caught early before the design ever got to the field, but it caused this particular office to be closed down and all the employees to be fired. But what were they trying to do? They in their own odd way, they had the best of intentions. They were trying to solve the client's problem, which is he had a site which was too steep to be fully developed. But they tried to solve it using dishonest means. And that's really the point I want to make. Clients hire us to solve their problems and to achieve their desired result if we can. But once you change existing conditions, the client's problem becomes your problems. To restate the obvious, you must play the cards you're dealt. And this happens to be an Anne Arundel County job, and I have seen this several times in Anne Arundel County, moving existing conditions to make them engineer more easily. Now, in my over 46 years of practice and as an employer, I've only summarily fired one employee, a senior engineer who was designing an apartment complex in Baltimore County. He was doing the stormwater management design, and he needed borings so that he could design the infiltration correctly. Now, he had two borings, boring one and boring two, but he needed a third boring, which was right between the two, and he didn't have it. And so he interpolated the soil conditions between the two borings, and he created boring number 3 out of thin air. Now, having he labeled boring number 3 as being interpolated, maybe, arguably, it might have been okay. But he labeled it just boring number 3, and it was completely made up. There could have been a rock shelf under boring number 3, or trash, or who knows what was under it. It was a made-up boring. I called him in, and I asked him what he did, and he said that he interpolated the boring and made it up, to which my response was, there's the door, don't let it hit you on your way out, and I'll see you later. And I tell these stories to all our new employees, and although I don't quite put it this way, what I really say is, if you lie, you die.
So only do what you know, and just as important, know well. But just as important as picking the right projects and not lying about existing conditions, picking the right clients is also essential. Nothing in the Code of Ethics says that you have to work for deadbeats. We don't have to work with clients who don't pay their bills, with whom we don't have a good professional working relationship, or who have a reputation for being litigious. Care in selecting your clients and the assignments and having a clear written agreement are the most effective loss prevention tools that we have. So many of you may have never physically sealed plans with a stamp or even provide a wet signature, since many in the industry have moved on to digital seals and signatures that can accompany digital submittals or be printed directly on plans. A digital seal should be treated with the same respect and care as a physical seal. Their meaning is the same. Consequently, all of the guidance for properly using an engineering seal applies to a digital seal as well. But of course, it's not that simple. A digital seal can create more opportunities for plans to be sealed without the engineer ever having looked at them. You should consider carefully how your digital plans are saved and modified when your seal is shown. Avoid creating sealed plans unnecessarily, and consider keeping the engineer's seal and signature off of draft or progress plan sets. If at all possible, only show the seal or the signature and seal on a reviewed and approved plan. Remember, if the plan has the engineer's seal and signature, then you are claiming that the engineer has personally either prepared, supervised, or reviewed them, and that they meet the applicable engineering standards. If this is not the case, then the signed seal should not be included on the plans. To support this effort, you may want to consider restricting access to the digital seal to help avoid erroneously showing it on unreviewed plans. Design and drafting technology has made it easier than ever to work over or modify existing plans. When sealing over another professional engineer's work, you are required to notify them of the changes you are making. But this step is frequently forgotten by many engineers. This can lead to problems identifying where one engineer's responsibility ends and the other's begins. I recommend taking steps to securely archive a record of sealed plan submittals. This can help you verify the work that you completed should someone else improperly modify your plans.
I want to talk a little bit about conflicts of interest. And a conflict of interest is a secondary interest to your primary one that may color, cloud, or compromise your decision-making process. Conflicts of interest frequently arise in the course of our practice, but as the Gospel of Matthew succinctly puts it, no one can serve two masters. Conflicts of interest should be avoided where possible, but the guiding principle should be transparency, and when in doubt, disclose. Before I was a practicing engineer, I was a land developer and a builder, which is somewhat unusual. Many engineers have gone into the land development business, most of whom went broke, but I'm the only one I know who went from the development business into engineering. And for several years, I ran parallel businesses. And one day, a client said to me, "Are you an idiot? Don't you know that you can't compete with your clients? Either be a developer or be an engineer, but you can't be both at the same time in the same location." And he was absolutely correct. Happily, as it turns out, I chose engineering. And I find when potential conflicts of interest arise, it's best to simply disclose them and possibly simply ask permission. In only one case that I can recall throughout all my years of practice was I ever denied permission, but if the client objects after it's been disclosed, you must recuse or decline the additional assignment. Now, we want to leave you with one final thought, and that is the importance of good general business practices. Yes, I know it can be a pain, but in order to run a good business, we need to, in addition to getting the business, keep accurate timesheets, prepare, send, and collect timely bills, maintain sufficient funds to pay our employees, their withholding and employment taxes, and most importantly, have sufficient capital resources so that we can have the discipline not to take every job and to properly and professionally complete every assignment. Simply put, when you get into financial trouble, you do things you shouldn't do. We understand that maintaining the disciplines of good business practices can be difficult and tedious, but failure to do so can pave the way to real trouble.
All right, so thank you for your attention. We hope you found some useful takeaways on engineering ethics and maintaining good business practice. Remember, at the heart of ethics lies the public's trust in engineering professionals. Building trust can be a long, slow process, but breaking it only takes a second. Ethics is not simply something we should adhere to out of the goodness of our hearts, but rather it is essential for a successful business. Good work and a good reputation is the best kind of marketing anyone could hope for.
But Andrew, as just one special added attraction, I think we should reveal to our audience today the absolute secret of success in the engineering profession.
Absolutely, yes.
It's bow ties. Thank you all for your kind attention. It's been our pleasure, Andrew and I, to present this today. We hope you've learned something. And Tim or Elizabeth, whoever is monitoring the chat box, will be very happy to take questions.
Yes, we do have a few questions for you both today. And then we do have possibly someone you owe $10 to, but we'll get to that later. First thing that we have a question regarding the recent sea change in the natural gas industry, where the NTSB has issued recommendations to 31 states to remove PE utility exemptions. In Maryland and other states, these regs have been rolled out with the assumption that a seal inherently makes the construction print safer, yet the industry has a shortage of engineers who are actually licensed. The sheer volume of work requiring seals combined with the lack of widespread knowledge of engineers in the field is a massive ethical dilemma some of us are facing? Or like your comments on that.
Wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's a good question. Wow.
Wow. Tim, frankly, we had a little trouble hearing the whole question, but I think it goes to the industrial exemption in engineering licensing. This is a really big issue, and I think the issue in natural gas is coming up from the explosion up in Newton, Massachusetts, where a young engineer working for the utility, but I think it was Columbia Gas actually, designed a gas distribution system, but misdesigned the pressure control, and it blew up a big piece of Newton, Massachusetts. Um, the whole issue of unlicensed engineers in industry is a really a big issue. And the argument is that most industrial projects come under consumer protection laws, and so you don't need licensed engineers. I think you know what my response is. If you don't have licensed engineers who have the right education and the right experience, which professional engineers have, then you're going to have disasters. And the Challenger disaster, the Newton disaster, arguably the Surfside disaster, all point to the necessity to have licensed engineers, competent engineers. And if you don't have enough competent engineers in the gas industry, you need to go get some, or you're going to have more disasters. That's my thought on it.
Yeah.
Yes, David, sorry, this is Bobby Geis. I was the asker of the question.
Oh, okay. Sorry,
I'm in an interesting position because I am a PE who is employed by a gas operator in the state, and I've been closely involved with this issue and the drafting of the regulations as part of the Maryland PSC working group on this topic. So I think there was a lot of question marks that we're still left with as we transition into 2022 and this regulation goes into effect. To your point, I do agree. One of the issues that I think we still have left yet to resolve is the fact that because these exemptions have been in place for so long in the industry, we have a lot of experienced personnel who are engineers, some of whom have 25, 30 plus years of experience. And their approval capabilities are going to be nullified by the requirement of a signature and seal on a print. And I think we do have some worry that such an expedited rollout of this requirement could almost inappropriately incentivize individuals to get their license perhaps too soon, and maybe put a rush on or an implied pressure on certain firms or operators in the industry to just get that stamp on it. You often hear that, who's going to stamp it? Who's going to stamp it? I've been trying to take the ethical stance and explain to folks that there's, we have a lot of folks in my company that don't have an engineering background. So trying to explain to them the ethical foundation of why we seal prints and, what's appropriate has been a tremendous challenge.
Well, I know. Well, Bobby, I actually know nothing, about the new legislation, so I really can't help on that. But what you describe is an issue we all have. In all engineering companies, there are some excellent engineers who have been practicing whatever our area is and never got licensed for whatever the reason. Some of the older, some may not have gone to college, or ever. And these are excellent, wonderful engineers. But I think if you have engineers who aren't competent designing things, you're going to have a higher frequency of disasters. And so I think, what do you do? So I think it is appropriate to have the work, even of a very competent designer, reviewed and sealed by a licensed professional engineer, or get those unlicensed designers a license, many of whom aren't licensed because there's really been no necessity under the industrial exemption. And I think, not to put too fine a point on it, but our role as NSPE and MDSPE is to protect the public. And I don't think you protect the public by having unlicensed engineers, incompetent engineers, designing things, and licensing them is one area of protection. That's just my opinion. I'm sorry, Andrew.
Sure, no, you're fine. I think the only thing I would add to that, I think Bobby's very wise though in saying we want to be careful in the way that the legislation is rolled out, because what we don't want is to create a situation where, like what we've just described in our presentation, where there's all this pressure and lack of engineers, and now you've got engineers just signing and sealing stuff they're not even looking at, or whatever the scenario, or people who aren't competent being licensed just to check a box, we got to seal it. And so, I think as an industry, we need to be careful about, not only do we want to make sure that people are competent and licensed appropriately, but we're also creating a regulatory environment where that there is room for that to be done, so that we're not putting engineers in ethical dilemmas.
Well, sure.
I think it's a perfect segue, gentlemen, to another question, which is, I'm often asked to sign various certifications, generally to the effect that nothing will ever go wrong. For instance, I'm frequently asked to sign a certification that our design meets all local, state, and federal codes and regulations, or that the work has been constructed in complete accordance with the design drawings. Should I sign those?
Well, I'm glad you asked. I'm glad you asked. Certifications are the rope with which we hang ourselves. And by that definition, one of the other things I'm constantly amazed at is how few engineers really understand what a certification means. And by definition, the words certify, warrant, or guarantee mean to assure the total accuracy of something or to confirm absolute compliance with the standard. Now, legally, these words and their derivatives are virtually synonymous. And therefore, if you certify or warrant something, you are guaranteeing that something is unequivocally true, correct, or perfect. Now, in our office, had it yesterday, we're often asked to certify that zoning, that the zoning on a site is some particular zoning and that it permits a particular use. Well, can an engineer really say that? Now, we don't say the zoning is industrial on this site and it permits warehouses. What we say is that Section 101 of the zoning ordinance says that this particular zoning permits warehouses. Now, the fact that the ordinance says that is something that we can say and that we know to be absolutely true. But for us to say that the zoning permits warehouses or some other specific use is actually a legal conclusion, okay, that we really can't certify, and that's best to left to others. Now, also, we would suggest being very careful about absolute wording, such as all or every. And for instance, we're often asked to certify that a contractor has constructed a building in perfect accordance with the design drawings. But can you really say that a contractor has correctly placed all the rebar in a foundation? First of all, I suspect he hasn't. And even if you were looking over his shoulder day and night 24/7, you couldn't absolutely guarantee that he successfully completed all the work without defect. So when you certify or warrant something, you are assuming a liability well beyond the standard of care required by law. And as we heard in the prior session this morning, your professional liability insurance is only designed to cover violations of the standard of care. It is not designed, it does not cover contractual failures, and it does not cover breach of a warranty. So if you warrant something, you may very well not be insured for that. So I would suggest a couple of possible solutions. We don't, we wouldn't certify that a building is constructed in absolute accordance with the applicable codes and standards. We would say, I certify that to the best of my knowledge, information, and belief. Now that's something we can certify to. We know what our knowledge, information, and belief is, that the building was constructed in accordance with the general conformance to the plans and specifications, and that it's in compliance with, usually we'd be asked to say, all applicable laws, codes, and ordinances. Well, can we really say that any construction conforms with all laws? Do we know all laws? And especially ADA, we're often asked to certify compliance with ADA. ADA is so specialized that you really need somebody who's an expert in ADA to certify to that, because not only is it a tricky code, but there are advocates who go looking at developments and filing lawsuits for those developments that arguably don't meet ADA. And if you're the designer, doesn't matter what kind of designer you are, you will get sucked into that lawsuit. So my advice is be very careful about certifications.
Well,
Tim, do you have any more questions?
I do. To follow up on that, are there any other techniques for limiting liability?
Well, we always put a limitation of liability. In our contracts. Now, it's perfectly ethical. It's perfectly ethical. And I always look to the home inspectors, which often are not PEs. For $250, the home inspector will come out and inspect the house, typically that you're going to buy. But in all the home inspection contracts, there's a limitation of liability, that the liability is limited to the $250, the cost of the home inspection. Now, the home inspector, and I've had this in the past, can make a colossal mistake. He can make a $10,000 or a $20,000 mistake. The foundation could be bad, and he may have missed it, but his liability is only limited to the cost of the home inspection. Now, that's a little extreme, but it is not so extreme to limit liability either to the amount of insurance or to a specific number, I don't know, $1 million, let's say, or to the amount of engineering services. And that's another very, I disagree a little bit with the prior discussion. I understand the reason for not having completely written contracts, because it sometimes avoid noxious indemnity provisions. But if you do have a written contract, you can make it very favorable to yourself, and you can add things like limitation of liability. If you don't have a written contract and it doesn't have limitation of liability, you can get sued for whatever the damages are.
Yeah, and I would say, kind of adjacent to that would be, and Dave touched on this when he was talking about certifications. Whether you're in your contracts or even in your emails or texts or whatever, avoid the extreme languages. Be very, very conscious of things that say all, or in any case, and things like that. I mean, those big liability words. You just have to be conscious of.
Well, since you mentioned emails, I think I want to jump in. I want to talk, even though we mentioned it earlier, I think I want to talk about emails a little bit. I cannot express enough how dangerous emails are, and we treat them very casually. We treat them like a telephone conversation between friends. Emails never die. Social media never dies. Be very careful what you put in an email. Emails are discoverable. You will have to turn over all emails in the case of a lawsuit, and be careful what you say. In a moment of frustration, I'm sure all of us have said, you know, that county review out there is an idiot for not having reviewed my plans. Well, inevitably, that email will get back to the person that you disparaged. In one rather notable case recently, a very senior a person in Baltimore County made some disparaging comments about the administration in an email to somebody else. It got back, and that person was fired. So I cannot emphasize enough how much I would reinforce what Andrew says. Be very careful and benign what you put in emails. I've been married for almost 45 years, and if there's one lesson I've learned about marriage, it's never confess. So don't remember that for emails as well.
This isn't a marriage advice lecture, David.
Oh, why not?
Okay. Well, speaking of interest, there seems to be a high level of interest with you in the Mason and Dixon survey. Could you explain a bit?
It's hard to explain. Yeah, it's hard to explain. But the Mason-Dixon survey of 1762 to 1767 was the most outstanding engineering achievement and scientific achievement of the Enlightenment. And what's interesting to me is it happened right here on the Delaware, what's now the Maryland, Delaware, Pennsylvania line. And all the records related to it, including the contract for the survey signed by Lord Baltimore and the Penns and Mason and Dixon, the bill for the survey, and the final map of a survey are right here in Baltimore. And what's particularly interesting to me is that the contract for the survey, which is a piece of parchment about 30 inches by 30 inches, with a lot of whereases in it. It's exactly like a survey contract that we would write today. It's time and material. And so the most outstanding engineering achievement you can find the documents for right here in Baltimore, and you can go find it right out on the land. And that's what interests me about it. Tim, do you have anything else?
That is all. David, Andrew, thank you for this session. Just based on the chat, everyone really enjoyed it. Ethics is that hard PDH to get, and sometimes it's not as interesting as the way you both explained it today. So we really appreciate you guys spending the time you have with us this morning. I want to give Steve Broyles a shout out. I think you might owe him $10. He did put in the chat all of the all of your letters.
If he got FRGS, which is Fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, right, I'm going to give him $20.
He did. He
my God.
He did. So congratulations, Steve. This is recorded.
Steve,
so
you win.
it is
You
a
win
contract.
the $20.
$20 of Venmo or PayPal you later. We really do appreciate it.
Steve, do you take American Express?
We'll send you a bill and we'll reimburse them.
Dave's got credit with my firm.
Thank you. Well, hey, this was a fantastic session. I could tell from the energy from everybody in the chat how well it went. I really want to thank you both again, not only for your leadership on the board, but for your time you dedicated to obviously putting on an excellent presentation this morning. We are not done. We have another session starting at 10:40 with Matt Reifer on explaining the bipartisan infrastructure bill and what does it mean for engineering. So again, if you're going to join that, go back to your email or the PDF. The link will be in that for you to join the next session. And if you're looking for the PDH from David and Andrew's session, you'll be issued in the next couple of days and will receive an email on how you can access those credits. Gentlemen, thank you for your time, everyone. We hope to see you in about 5 minutes on the other side. Thank you.
Thank you all.